interdisciplinary hub. Oh, well, now we know. To build an interdisciplinary hub for sharing knowledge about the Himalayan region. And that includes Bhutan. We recently had a talk about Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Tibetan cultural zones that traverse and transect all of those countries. We began in the fall of 2015, and initial projects and programs included developing an intensive Nepali and Tibetan language and community engagement learning program that runs both in the summers and the Tibetan runs year-long. It's operated for 5 years now, and it's been really exciting. I'll come on to that in a moment. We host a regular speaker series, events with leading scholars from around the world, and we are creating the vision for an interdisciplinary network across UBC, the Lower Mainland here, and even into neighboring Washington State, where we have lots of colleagues working on aligned fields and topics. The Nepali language in community context course and the Tibetan language in community context course will be offered by the Department of Asian Studies in collaboration with our program. For those who are interested in learning Nepali, and imagine you learn food words in the morning and then you try out Nepali foods in the afternoon, so you put your knowledge into practice. The Tibetan course will be offered from the 15th of May to May 26, highly compressed. And the Nepali course will run from the 4th of July to the 14th of July. They're currently scheduled to be in-person courses, and you can learn more about them on our website. Our program also runs a very modest, non-invasive email list through which you can learn more about what we're doing. Please consider signing up. There's a sign-up sheet going around, both for that, but also so for UBC's purposes, we can tell them who ate the momos. It's an important part of it. Every bite counts. In the UBC Himalaya program, the partnerships that we're committed to are our strength. They're the core of our program. And we're really fortunate that many different units, departments have come together across campus to make this evening's talk possible. So we're grateful to colleagues in the Department of Asian Studies, and in particular, Jessica Main and the Robert H.N. Ho Family Foundation, to also the Center for India and South Asia Research and the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies, all of whom have offered financial, logistical, and intellectual support for this event. We are always grateful to the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and the Institute of Asian Research for their foundational support in making all of these activities possible, and to the Office of the Dean of Arts for their support and interest in the Himalaya program. We would be nowhere without our tireless Himalaya program assistant, Solia Dakal, standing in the back there. Thank you, Solia, for all you do. Thank you. And that's true, the UBC Institute for Climate Justice recently founded as well. Thank you, Pasana. The UBC Himalaya Program annual lecture was established in order to create an interdisciplinary and inclusive space for Himalayan studies in Canada. We draw together faculty, students, community members, as you've seen, as you are proving by being here. It is our goal that this lecture, and it's our third this year, connect with the general public and also with members of the Himalayan community here in Vancouver and across the Lower Mainland. We are delighted to welcome the speaker this year, but I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Pasang Yangji Sherpa, to introduce our guest. Pasang.
Thank you, Mark. I just needed to adjust the mic for my height. But I'm glad the camera is facing directly at me and not half of my forehead. Okay, so it's such a pleasure and an honor to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dekila Chungyalpa. And as many of you already must have known, she's the founder and director of the Loka Initiative at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at their Center for Healthy Minds. She is an accomplished environmental program director with 20+ years of experience in designing and implementing global conservation and climate strategies and projects. Known as an innovator in the environmental field, Dekila has expertise in faith-led environmental and climate partnerships, biodiversity landscape and river basin strategy design, and community-based conservation. She began her career in 2001 working on community-based conservation in the Eastern Himalayas, and went on to work on climate adaptation and free-flowing rivers in the Mekong River region for the World Wildlife Fund in 2004. In 2008, she helped establish Koru, an association of over 50 Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and nunneries, implementing environmental projects across the Himalayas under the auspices of His Holiness the Karmapa. In 2009, Dekila founded and led WWF Sacred Earth, a 5-year pilot program that built partnerships with faith leaders and religious institutions towards conservation and climate results in the Amazon, East Africa, Himalayas, Mekong, and the United States. She received the prestigious Yale McCloskey Award in 2014 for her work and moved to the Yale School of Environmental Studies as an associate research scientist, where she researched, lectured, and designed the prototype for what is now the Loka Initiative. Dekila is originally from the Himalayan state of Sikkim in India and is of Bhutia origin. And it's truly an honor and a pleasure to finally meet her in person this week and actually be able to introduce her and welcome her to give her presentation this evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Basangla. The best part is I don't have to adjust this too much. We're the same height. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so grateful to UBC's Himalaya program, critical indigenous studies, climate, I heard something like that, just climate justice, yay. So when I designed and thought about this particular talk I wanted to give, I felt like because it is such a reunion and union of the Himalayan family that is spread across in North America, I actually will make it more personal and talk a little bit more about my value system and what made me veer away from mainstream conservation and climate solutions and do the work I do. And so that means I actually don't talk very much about systemic injustices. I don't talk about neoliberalism, capitalism, any of the systemic approaches. So feel free to ask me questions about that. And so let me start by sharing my screen. So I really want to start by just paying my respects to the Musqueam people. And is that mine? Hold on. This is always what worries me on Zoom. Okay, we're good. And the fact that they're unceded lands, right? Because that means that people fought until the very end to actually have the rights to manage the lands, not just because it's land that belonged to them, but because these indigenous peoples belong to the land. And I think this is a concept that often gets overlooked, that when we talk about indigeneity and in relationship to the land, what is often forgotten is that we as indigenous peoples actually don't think the land belongs to us. It's the other way around. We belong to the land, right? And I also wanted to pay respects to my land of origin. This is Mount Kanchenjunga. And so, okay, good question is, how many of you have heard of Kanchenjunga? And the students that heard me today don't get to raise their hands. So Kanchenjunga is the 3rd tallest peak on the planet, but most people have never heard of him. And the reason why they've not heard of him is because we, as the Sikkimese people, the Lepcha, the Bhutia, the Song, and the Limbu, we refuse to allow him to be climbed. For us, monetizing his desecration, right, which is somebody climbing up and putting a flag on it, is just not acceptable. And as you can imagine, there have been all kinds of lucrative deals that have been put in front of the Sikkimese people and the government. And each time there is this whole revolution in the community, usually led by the Lepcha, sort of saying this cannot happen, and then it goes away. And it kind of highlights why right now, when we talk about the importance of indigenous peoples, why over 80% of biodiversity is actually found in indigenous managed lands. And that really is because we put our bodies on the line when it comes to protecting nature and non-human life. And so I grew up in Sikkim. Sikkim is known in my language, in the Bhutia language, as Beyul Demojong. And I don't know how many of you know of this concept of Beyul. Beyul in the Himalayas, really, it translates to hidden land or sacred lands. And the myth around Bayuls is that these are spaces that one of the great saints of Tibetan Buddhism, Guru Muchi or Padmasambhava, identified as safe sanctuaries, as refuge, essentially, during difficult times, when the planet starts to actually break down. In the degenerate times, some of you may have heard this phrase, right? When things really get difficult, Bayul is where we will be safe. And so it has a great deal of meaning for us in the Himalayas. And Sikkim is not the only Bayul, actually. Pasamla also comes from a Bayul, and there are several Bayuls around the Himalayas, which is, again, this idea of a safe refuge where all of us can go and thrive, right? And so I grew up in that setting, and then I grew up as the daughter and the granddaughter of Tibetan nuns. So my mother took her vows, that's my mother in the foreground, took her vows when I was a child and followed my grandmother's role modeling. And my mother ended up going into 3-year retreat in Sherabling in the western part of India when I was a child. And so I was essentially raised by nuns, and that informed my entire identity until about the age of 15, when I was sent to the US to study. And of course, when I arrived in the US, you can imagine what a shock that was, because the place they decided to send me was New York City. So I went from the middle of nowhere to New York City, and that was an adjustment. And so there are several concepts that I grew up with that I thought this is a wonderful place for me to actually explore them with you, because I think all of us are brought together by the love for the Himalayas or interest in Buddhism, right? So probably the concept in Buddhism that kind of is the firmament of all Buddhist philosophy and religion is this idea of Dendel, which is interdependence. And that basically, sort of underpins every other philosophy that comes after. Dendel basically means that there is no self. We cannot exist as selves. We could not exist as selves because of our parents. If we didn't have our parents, we would not have the genetic kind of amalgamation that makes us, right? But we could not exist as ourselves with the momos in our bellies if somebody hadn't cooked that, somebody hadn't ordered it, somebody hadn't grown it. So the idea of interdependence is actually really practical, and all of our meditation practice, all of the philosophy, all of the politics, everything actually emerges from this very basic concept. The other slightly challenging concept that also is brought to us all the time, it doesn't matter how old we are, we're kind of trained to think about this, is mitappa, which means impermanence. And this idea is where we learn to not be so attached to ourselves, our thoughts, our preferences, right? Because we are constantly being reminded by the elders that everything is mitappa, everything changes. And what we're being taught through that teaching is to actually become comfortable with change itself, right? Feel all right about the fact that we are being forced to adapt to things all the time. And in my case, it was really personal because my grandmother and my mother passed away when I was in my early 20s. So mitappa ended up being this thing that was really alive for me. And I had a choice whether I would, in a way, in a sense, like sort of drown in grief, or I would kind of rise above it and decide to take the teachings they had given me. And I think out of the combination, right, of the interdependence and the idea that everything is impermanent, including ourselves, comes this concept of compassion. So this is what, His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about a lot. So people are really comfortable with this idea. But philosophically, what's really important is that idea of interdependence, as well as the idea of impermanence. So Nyingje and compassion for us is very much this idea that when we see someone else, they are, in a sense, an extension of ourselves. They are, because also we're impermanent, we could be them in any moment. And so the othering tends to drop, right? This idea of self and other is something that becomes more fluid. It's something we can play with. And finally, being raised by nuns who also happen to be major feminists, and Bhutia women are pretty loud. My training and my sort of upbringing was very defined by this idea of Yum Chenmo. For those of you who are Tibetan Buddhist sort of experts, so this is the embodiment of Prajnaparamita, and she represents sort of great compassion and great emptiness and great bliss all at once. She's sort of the culmination of all meditation, right? And it's fascinating to me because anyone who does emptiness meditation in particular, this is who you end up becoming one with. And it's always interesting to me that she's described as the great mother, because what I think about all the time is, well, who else do we trust when we decide we're going to dissolve our identities, right? And just give up our attachment to ourselves? Who do we trust to hold us together in that moment? And it's like, here we have the great mother who does it. My Bhutia friend and colleague, Kalsang Bhutia, often tells this story, so I sort of integrated it into mine. I grew up in West Sikkim for several years of my childhood with my mother, and all of these things that I pointed out to you, all of these different concepts that I pointed out to you meant that it was manifested in ways that were really just everyday phenomena. And one of that is that the Himalayan black bear and other animals as well. So the Bhutia word or the Tibetan word for a bear is dhom, but we could never say dhom if we saw one. Like if I saw a dhom and I went running to my family to say there's a dhom, I would get scolded. I would have to say aku dhom, which means uncle bear. And so Kalsang was telling the story and I just had this immediate memory of my childhood. And so I thought I'd incorporate it. All of that is a way of saying, well, it's no surprise. I grew up, I became an environmentalist. I studied science. I shifted from a PhD to a master's program because I was so panicked about what was happening in the Himalayas with environmental and climate change, and ended up working for the World Wildlife Fund. This photo was taken, I think, in 2006. So I was at that time just made the field program director for the Greater Mekong region. I was the youngest program director they had. I was the only woman of color, the only Indigenous woman that they had who was leading a program like this. And I have talked about this quite a bit because I think it's worth pointing out that in the Western sense, I had never been more successful, right? The idea of our careers, the idea of climbing that ladder, the idea of the glacis, all of those basically push us towards a direction, which is that in the West, what success means is that you get the highest amount of money, you get the most amount of money and the highest title and the best office, right? And I had gotten all of these in my early 30s. And yet what I was experiencing was deep trauma. Because what was happening was that in real time, I was starting to understand what was the long-term impacts of climate change and environmental losses in the communities I worked in. And so the two issues I was especially affected by and that I work on are wildlife conservation. So since 1970, close to 70% of all wild animal, bird, and fish populations have vanished. That is in mass. So literally 70% of a population of every non-human species has disappeared, right? And global warming. So for those of you who are not tracking it, we have had 12 months where on average around the planet, we have crossed the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold. That means that now our planet is 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer than in the mid 1800s, right? Which is when we started recording temperature. And so the 1.5 degrees centigrade is really significant for climate scientists because that is when we set, that is the benchmark or the aspirational goal that we set, saying as long as we don't cross this, we're still okay. There is going to be ecosystem transformation. We are going to lose, a lot of stability in the ecosystems, some variability, but we can manage. But once we cross it, there's a lot of destruction ahead. Well, we have crossed it, and it's been a year since we crossed it every single month. So this, what was an aspiration, has now ended up being a baseline, right? Now this is the new normal. And I think people really get stuck when we talk about environmental and climate issues, they really stay on those two topics. But I want to take a step back and talk about how the planet actually exists. So the planet regulates itself constantly, and the planet has 9 different systems, so ecological systems that gives us our air, gives us our water, gives us, agriculture, allows us to live in relatively stable times, right? And we've been that way for about 11,000 years. This period is known as the Holocene. This is why we could actually grow crops. why we could settle down as people, right? Why we could multiply the way we did and flourish the way we did. And from those 9 different systems, 6 of them, we've essentially crossed 6 of them. And so we're in the danger zone for 6 of them. So I talked about biodiversity, but this is another way of looking at it. So 10,000 years ago, we were 1%. Now we're at 32%. But look what's fascinating. Actually, guess which species is dominating the planet? It's livestock. It's actually livestock that has really increased, right? Novel entities is one of the planetary boundaries. So novel entities is a way of talking about all the chemicals and the man-made things we put out in the air. So some of you might have seen it. We can find now plastic, microplastics in Mount Everest. Embryos, all the embryos tested are showing microplastics, right? But it goes far beyond that. So there are at least 350,000 different types of manufactured novel entities that are out there, and we don't know what it does. Some cases we do. You can ask. Okay. Biogeochemicals. So this really is nitrogen when you think about phosphorus and nitrogen and all the fertilizer, right? Because we are mass producing food these days. And ironically, it's not necessarily for consumption. A lot of it is going for the livestock I mentioned earlier. A lot of it stays in warehouses because we want prices to go up, right? It's not actually meeting the hunger that happens to exist on the planet. So biogeochemicals, maybe some of you have seen this. What I'm showing you is actually algae bloom, which is in the ponds and freshwater systems, marine systems. So this is one of the other planetary boundaries that we've crossed. We can all take a deep breath. It's really heavy. It's really scary, right? And so when I was describing the emotions that I was experiencing in 2006, it was really this combination of panic and despair, because I spent all my time trying to convince corporations and governments to work together towards solutions. I was partly responsible for coming up with a regional climate adaptation plan with my colleagues. And lo and behold, no government really wants to work with us on it, right? And at that time, these terms didn't exist that exist now. So we have terms like eco-anxiety now, climate distress now, but none of that had been studied yet. And so it was just something I was carrying around me as trauma. And in my case, I just happened to be incredibly fortunate. And in 2008, I went to Bodh Gaya, whom some of you might know. It is the place where Buddha was enlightened. So it's sort of a major pilgrimage site for Buddhists all around the world. And I have to confess, my family dragged me to it. And I'm sitting there and I hear His Holiness the Karmapa speak. So he is the head of the lineage that I belong to in Tibetan Buddhism. And he gave a talk on vegetarianism and how it mattered from a Buddhist point of view, which, I kind of maybe heard before, but then I heard him talk about how it matters in terms of climate change. And it was as if a light bulb went off for me, because I was sitting there and I remember he asked this general question, I am vegetarian, how many of you want to go vegetarian? And a sea of hands went up. And what I realized, as a social scientist was, oh my God, this is mass behavior change. What is going on right now, right? And as it happened, he asked me to create environmental guidelines for Tibetan Buddhist monasteries that year. So I gave up 2 weeks of my vacation, ran home, worked with all the senior monks and nuns, and produced a set of environmental guidelines. And then I went back to Laos and started doing my WWF work. And I got a call from the office saying, you need to come back because all the monasteries want training now. And so then I had to return. And this is when we did the first training in 2009 in Varanasi. And 22 monasteries and nunneries sent their delegates so that they could get environmental science training. And it was the first time I realized that there was so much hunger for science in the communities of faith. Even though I was a daughter of a faith leader, it had never occurred to me that they might be interested in science the way I was, right? To understand what is happening in the planet, to the planet. And in the process of doing this 5-day workshop with them, monks and nuns started saying, these are the issues we care about. So invariably, how many of you have been to Nepal? So no surprise, the 2 issues all the monasteries and nunneries in Nepal picked: water, garbage, right? No surprise if you're from there. Monasteries in the south of India were picking wildlife because they had wildlife-human conflict. Monasteries in northern India were picking forests and other issues. But what was fascinating to me was that monasteries themselves were essentially claiming ownership over environmental climate issues and saying that they wanted to do something about it. And lo and behold, a movement was born. No plans, completely organic, completely driven by the faith leaders in the community. So we suddenly had all of these monasteries that were doing reforestation, right, of indigenous saplings that started incorporating wildlife protection messaging in rituals, that organized themselves to do cleanups after disasters, that took on garbage cleaning and made it incredibly personal so that they would all show up in the community to do it together, which was unheard of in our culture. We like our monks and nuns to sit in brocade seats far away in the monastery. And the fact that they were in the community dirtying themselves and cleaning up was sort of almost, they had the strongest reaction. You know, the community members were actually organizing themselves and hiring what we call jamdars, which is like the street sweepers, so the monks and nuns wouldn't have to do it. And then in 2015, the Nepal earthquake happened. And what we found was that the Koryuk monasteries that had had some disaster management training were actually more prepared than any of the other monasteries in the region. And so His Holiness then said, the focus for Koryuk is always now going to be disaster planning. And so we now have over 1,000 monks and nuns all across the Himalayas that are trained to be first responders, that know how to do first aid, that can take a stretcher, like take their robes and build a stretcher out of it in like 15 minutes, and that are now demonstrating it in different communities all over. And there have been so many unexpected co-benefits that have come. So because the monasteries were really concerned about climate change and they realized they want to be as self-sufficient as possible, many of them turned all their flower gardens into like small scale farming. And so they have better food. They have fresh vegetables. You know, there are all these unexpected benefits that have come from doing this work. So you can ask, well, why should it matter? Why does it matter that monks and nuns are doing this work, right? And so I want to take a second and just look at the big picture. What you're looking at is basically the hydro sheds of mainland Asia. And if you go from left to right, what you're looking at is the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Salween, Irrawaddy, Mekong, Yellow, and Yangtze rivers. Now, all of the people that live in these river basins, there's probably over 1.5 billion of people that live here. And I want you to take a second and think about what all of these river systems have in common. You can shout out your answer if you want. They all originate from Tibet. They all originate from the Tibetan Plateau. They're all glacier fed. And so what happens in Tibet affects the geopolitics, affects food security, affects livelihoods, affects everything you can think of downstream in these river basins. And we have such a tendency to not pay attention to that part of the region, right? But the reality is the monks and the nuns who are Tibetan Buddhist and who hold this fragile communities together are people who have incredible influence in the community. I don't know how many of you saw Game of Thrones, but this always reminds me of a Game of Thrones scene, you know, from tower to tower. But it's like, this really is what the Himalayan landscape is like. We can see monasteries from one monastery to the other. We are completely interconnected as a network. And we are not just a network of religious leaders, we are a network of support for communities. Whenever there is a disaster, whenever something goes wrong in the community, where do we tend to go? Where do we tend to congregate? Right? We go to our churches, we go to our mosques, we go to our monasteries. Naturally, that's where we're drawn to. And so making sure that these are the community leaders that are resourced to, first of all, understand what's happening in the region, what's going on with climate change, how is it impacting us, what can we do as individuals, what can we do as communities, right? It's absolutely essential as part of our climate adaptation strategy. So after doing all this work on the side privately, I finally went to WWF and said, let me do this globally. I think it will work anywhere in the world. I don't think it matters what religion we're working with. I don't think it matters what geography, because essentially people are the same. And my very transactional set of reasons for why they would let me do this work was basically this, right? Faiths are a major stakeholder group. They're incredibly important. It is actually our blind spot in the science community that we don't recognize that, right? And so they agreed and allowed me to create that program. But I had a much, much deeper reason why I wanted to work with faith groups. And it really was so that I could have a deeper conversation around what is happening to us psychologically and what is happening to us in our communities. Because what I can see now in the Himalayas, in my own community, and what of course is at display everywhere in the world, is that we are changing how we identify ourselves. We are becoming really used to thinking of ourselves as consumers first. You know, you ask someone what they like and they will tell you a list of brands, right? And the younger they are, the more likely they're to do that. And so we don't even realize that we're doing this, right? So we're doing this to ourselves, we're doing this to our psyche, but that what we're giving up in the process of doing that. Because in the process of becoming more connected with one another online, in the process of becoming consumers, right? What we're doing is giving up those interpersonal relationships we have in real life. And so I really wanted to have this dialogue, and nobody in the conservation community had time for it. And so I went over and started working with faith leaders so I can talk about it. But there are really tangible benefits of working with faith leaders. And so one of them being faith communities are the third largest financial investor group in the world together. And so when it comes to divesting from fossil fuels, which means you're moving your money out of investing in oil, mining, and gas, right? Faith communities are actually the biggest group that has been doing it in the last 10 years. And so over 30% of it is done by faith. So after a journey through WWF and Yale, I landed at UW-Madison, thanks to Richie Davidson, John Dunn, and a bunch of other people. And I ended up launching this program called the Loka Initiative. And so I explained all of those Buddhist concepts to you to get to this point, which is my vision for this program is very Buddhist, right? It is that our inner, our community, and our planetary resilience are interdependent, just like everything else on the planet. We cannot achieve any one of these goals without working on the other two. And Loka has three big activity streams. So I'm just going to go through, I'll give you examples for a few of them. So the two that really matter is we do capacity building with faith leaders and Indigenous leaders, and we do resource and research development around eco-anxiety and climate distress. Our criteria for who we work with in the faith community is essentially people that have been left out from the big climate and environmental movement. So it's basically the people that don't show up in the UN events. And front and center, the group that I chose to work with most are evangelicals in the US. So I work with evangelical church leaders. We have a format that works really well for us. We bring about 20 evangelical church leaders to Madison every year. We have a 5-day closed room event where scientists and faith leaders get into deep dialogue around what they agree on and what they don't agree on. And it can get very dramatic. Sometimes people walk out. Sometimes it's not the faith leaders that walk out. It can be the scientists. But essentially, we are committed to being in this conversation with each other because we recognize what's at stake, and that is the health of our communities, right? And then throughout the rest of the year, we stay with this cohort of evangelical preachers, and we keep providing the support that they need. And sometimes they just want some training on certain topics. Sometimes, you know, it's interesting what kinds of requests come in. Sometimes it's they want media training. They want to know how to write an op-ed in a way so that they don't use the words climate change, but they are talking about climate change to an evangelical congregation. So it's a whole range of needs that they have that we try and meet. And then the following year, we do the same thing again. And then the work that we're doing with Indigenous leaders, so we work with 7 Wisconsin tribes, tribal elders and knowledge holders. I thought it might be better to actually just show you what that looks like. So I'm gonna try doing this. So this is a really short teaser of the documentary. Oh, doesn't work.
The earth is not going in a good direction, and we as Indigenous people already know that. And I just wanted to add some perspective as an Indigenous person, because it's so important, the values that we have and the values that we hold, to share them and help as much as we can, because this is our Mother Earth.
There's a major difference for a young mind to really think about, because when they grow up, they're told, you can be anything you want. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You are in control of your future. That was a very different message. When I grew up, it was, we are responsible to each other. We're responsible for each other. When one comes up, we all come up. We need to protect things. It wasn't I or you in particular. It was all of us. This is a we thing that's happening.
We understand things. Everything's connected. Everything's related. This reservation, we don't own it. We're caretakers of it. And it's not our decision so much as you got to think systems-wide out of this whole reservation, and the animals that live here, and that water that's alive, and birds, everything. So you have to understand whatever that trade-off is, it can't just be for people and for humans.
The incredible thing is, in this moment right now, people are willing to hear us, and having access to each other and sharing knowledge in safe spaces, knowing that that knowledge will be respected and not mistreated, but highly honored when you speak about it. It's standing in solidarity with other First Nations and saying that we're able to share resources, that we're stronger together. It's time. It's just time for us to do it.
Bring it back. Bear with me a second. Did I? Later. Huh. Can you, oh, sorry, is this showing up on Zoom again? Sorry, I'm terrible with technology. Okay, there we go. So, okay, better. So the reason why I wanted to show the teaser was because I think, yeah, the teaser speaks for itself. We're working on this documentary. It's with elders and knowledge holders from 7 different Native tribes up north of Wisconsin. And we're really focused on basically Indigenous resilience and what that looks like. But there are 2 things I wanted to bring up. One is that one of the elders who advised Loka, who is in the advisory council for Loka, she said that when we were creating this idea, that we think of this project as a pathway to bring the lost ones home. And by lost ones, she didn't mean just Indigenous peoples, she meant everybody, because one of the things that we have to recognize with the severity of the environmental crisis and the climate crisis is that we are in trouble as an entire planet. We're actually living in a way that is like on borrowed time, literally. And we are also in a time of deep uncertainty ecologically, where what we as environmental scientists are seeing is collapse, and we're not able to get the rest of the population to care about or understand, right? And so it seems to me that it's so absolutely necessary that we turn to deeper and more meaningful sources of wisdom than what we are used to getting. So it's like, maybe we let go of the Dr. Phils and the Oprahs, and we go find elders and teachers to actually follow and listen to, because that path has not given us anything that benefits the planet or anyone other than ourselves, right? And I think the other thing that I really wanted to say was that it's really easy to show projects and just say, here is the fancy like 3-second version of what I do. But all of these projects took 2 to 3 years to get off the ground, because the whole time what we were doing was listening. And all we did for the first couple of years was trust building. And if there is anything that I say tonight that I hope stays with you, it is this: there is no replacement for building trust if you want to do community work. Community work requires that you invest that time in trust building, and that you show up as a person of integrity and allow the community to decide if they want to work with you or not. And I think bypassing that is what has created such maladaptive forms of development, right? So that is the activity stream of capacity building. The activity stream that I wanted to talk about for a second on eco-anxiety and climate distress is something that we call the Resilience in the Anthropocene program. So we launched it last year. All the videos are up on YouTube if you want to watch it. It's 40 speakers, scientists, experts, community leaders from all around the world, contemplative leaders as well. And basically we had a dialogue around, well, what is inner resilience? What are the attributes versus systemic conditions of resilience? Those are two very different things, right? What does it look like psychologically? What does it look like in community? What does it look like ecologically? And out of that, we have launched, so let me take a second and just say, one of the things that I'm really invested in, for very obvious reasons, because I have eco-anxiety and climate distress, is really starting to unpack what these environmental emotions mean for us, because all of us are experiencing a certain amount of it, right? The thing is that the impact is very disproportionate depending on who you are. If you are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, or other people of color in the Americas, in the North Americas, if you are from the global South, if you're poor, right? If you're living in the coasts, right? We are experiencing heightened levels of anxiety and distress, aren't we? And so understanding that these emotions are not just this one sort of flat line, but that we're experiencing it in different ways is really necessary. And there are 3 areas that we see now. One is very much around the fear of the doom, right? Just general fear. One is very much around pain for the world. So this is the distress. We see animals we love being harmed. It hurts us, right? And finally, solastalgia, which is something that is especially common in Indigenous peoples, which is a homesickness for the land that we grew up with, that we identify with, that we belong to, that has changed in front of our eyes. And so part of that means that Loka is launching a course this May. You can check it out. It's going to be on edX. edX is free. Woohoo. It's in the global South. It's everywhere around the world. And so we're launching this 4-course certificate program, and it's all about the psychology of resilience. And the most important part of it is, no surprise, we have 15 contemplative practices that we're offering with it. And they come from 3 different wisdom traditions. So they're going to come from Buddhism, they are coming from Indigenous land-based healing, and they come from somatics, which is movement. So yoga could count as a somatic practice, right? And so we're drawing from these traditions because they have been studied so much by neuroscientists and psychologists, and we're confident. And we also offer a bunch of secular exercises for people. But this brings us back to this idea of we cannot fix the planet if we are not healthy emotionally and psychologically. We cannot fix ourselves if our societies are not doing well, right? If loneliness is now declared as an epidemic in the United States, we have a problem in our society, and that means we personally cannot do well. And so how do we integrate attributes and conditions of resilience so that they can mean the same things across these different disciplines? I'm going to wrap up now. So I just wanted to take a moment and just say that when it comes to environmental and climate issues, it often feels as a Bhutia person and as an Indigenous person that what we are experiencing is invisible to the rest of the world. You know, we are I think Indigenous peoples are supposed to be less than 5% of the global population, right? But we are holding down 80% of biodiversity because it matters so much to us. And because our identity is based on relationality. That means I cannot exist without the relationship I have to Uncle Bear, right? And so to me, it seems like there is something that really must change in how we view the earth. And the thing that I've come back to again and again is sort of the thing that gives me the greatest strength personally, and also the thing that really connects all the Himalayan ethnic communities that I know, which is this concept of taking refuge in something more than yourself, right? And in the Bayous and in the Himalayas, for us, we take refuge physically. It's not just something that we do while sitting in a nice seat, you know, in a safe room with like an orchid flower probably and good lighting and a Buddha statue. It's like we go out there and we actually do prostrations, right? We circumambulate mountains and lakes because they are all of the living entities that we see. Well, first of all, we see these phenomena as living entities, right? And then secondly, we see them as manifestations of, in a way, sacred mandalas, like they're right in front of us, right? And so we incorporate how we view that into our practice. And in the form, when we do these prostrations, what we're doing is purifying ourselves while engaging and being in relationship with the land. It is a communication that we have with the land. And I mean, for those of us, so I realize not everybody would know what refuge is. So for us in Buddhism, you know, this is the most common concept, right? You do not call yourself a Buddhist unless you have, at some point or the other, taken refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, or the Sangha. So by Buddha, I mean the enlightened one, right? All of us are potential Buddhas. All of us have this seed. By the Dharma is the wisdom, it's the path, it's the way. And the Sangha is the community. So we take refuge in these three things. And this is known as the outer objects of refuge. And then we have inner and secret and all kinds of other things. I won't get into that. So this is sort of the basis for us in the Himalayan communities and in the Buddhist communities. And that means that every time we're afraid, every time we're unsure, every time we have questions for ourselves, we go back to doing these prostrations and we take refuge in something greater than ourselves. It reaffirms who we are as people, but it also reminds us that the values that matter to us is not success, it's not money, it's not the car or the house. It really is, are we more compassionate than we were before, right? Do we understand interdependence? Are we comfortable with change and impermanence? Those are the actual indicators for our meditation practices, right? And so when I go back, when I think about Bayul and this idea of sacred space to me, I always have a little bit of conflict because from our point of view, everything is sacred, right? It's just the view itself. So if I look at something and decide that that thing is sacred, then automatically that thing is imbued with sacredness, right? It is a lens I can take on and off. And that is something that I think really matters when we think about the planet. We have a choice how we are in relation with the planet. And the only way we can save her, and therefore ourselves as a species, is by making this offering to save her, right? By making this offering of ourselves, our own bodies, our own speech, our own mind, right? Our mental well-being, our community well-being, our ecological well-being. It is an offering to the planet. We need to remember that we're one of many. We are one species among over 8 million species on this planet. And we sort of dominate it as if we're the only species that matter, right? So remembering that we're one among many. We are nearest to the sun. This is one of my favorite paintings by Dedo. So this is really referring to how Tibet is the sky of the world, the roof of the world, right? But it seems to me that also turning back to indigenous wisdom and indigenous peoples, because we live closest and lightest on the land, I think is really, really important. And finding ways to build these relationships and pathways and dialogues. And finally, This is a very famous cave painting from Chauvet in France, and it is 30,000 years old. So I am now, my program is housed at the Center for Healthy Minds, which is headed by Richie Davidson, and it's a bunch of neuroscientists and psychologists. And I eavesdrop on so many interesting conversations, but one of them is really about epigenetics of trauma. So that concept means that our genes actually carry the trauma of our grandparents, right? Great-great-grandparents. We genetically we have predispositions based on what our great-great-grandparents went through. And it's fascinating because then that tells us so much about ourselves, right? We have certain ways of reacting to things that may or may not be actually choices we've made, you know? But what I'm really intrigued by and excited about is, well, if there is epigenetics of trauma, then there has to be epigenetics of resilience. And that means that resilience is also something that is handed out genetically. And the world of possibility this opens up for us, for each one of us, when we think about who we are in the systems we're trying to transform, that we have choice over what we decide to take from our great-grandparents, first of all, but we also have choice in how we position ourselves in these systems, that we are not victims that are just sitting back allowing these things to happen to us, right? That we ourselves are standing forward saying that we will be part of the solution. And finally, I talked about Prajnaparamita, I talked about Yumchenmo, I talked about the Great Mother, but there is no greater mother than the earth, right? Each one of us, it doesn't matter, 8 million species, it doesn't matter if it's the redwoods, it doesn't matter the ocean, all the species, all of us, all the people we love, all the people we hate, all the people who hate us, right? All of it is happening here. And the earth is a closed system. So you have the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere, right? Nothing materially really leaves or enters it in massive amounts. Occasional meteor. I sometimes joke, egotistical billionaire. But nothing really leaves it. Nothing really enters, nothing really leaves. So everything that is happening here. And so like we think about the three kayas, right? It's happening here. You think about like Lama Yidam Khandor, it's happening here. Buddha, the Sangha that we talked about, right? Like all of that is happening here. And we are born, we live, hopefully we flourish, and then we die, right? And then we decompose. And then we become part of something else. And life just goes on and on and on. And we are part of the Great Mother, always. Thank you.